The Kuti Sicha is Chedek Chavches, volume 28, the second Sicha of Parshas Vayeloscha. This Sicha will explain the entire narrative, specifically the discussion between Moshe Rabbeinu and those who were impure and came to demand their opportunity, their right to participate in the Korban Pesach, exactly what went down and what was clarified. In order to better appreciate the Sicha, please review the Psukim in chapter 9, Perek Tes, at least from Pasuk Aleph through Zion, from 1 through 7. Now, as a quick introduction, so we're better familiar with some of the concepts that will be discussed in the Sicha. So we know that when it comes to the Korban Pesach, one of the primary rules is that Ein Nechol El Nuyov, or El Nishchat El Nuyov, that in order to be part of the Korban Pesach, when the Korban Pesach gets slaughtered, when it's being offered as a korban, you have to actually be registered. It only counts for those who are registered. How do you register? Anyone registered has to have the ability to at least consume the minutest amount of meat from that korban, which is at least a kazayas. In other words, if there is at least a kazayas, enough for that person, a person is able to consume it, and they're registered, then when the Pesach is offered, they are part of it, even if at the end they don't end up eating from it for whatever reason that may pop up later. Another thing to be familiar with, there's an inherent difference between a zevach and a korban. A zevach literally is translated as sacrifice, versus korban, which is sacrifice, which is translated as an offering. Now, what is the difference? We do find in the Torah that there are zvachim, that there are sacrifices, meaning that you have a certain time when you have to take an animal, slaughter it, and eat it for the purpose of the celebration of a festival, or in this case, as we'll see, Korban Pesach. However, once it goes in to the category and it assumes the status of korban, it has a whole different set of rules. Because a korban means that it's not just a sacrifice, but it's an offering for Hashem. There already it involves the sprinkling of the blood on the Mizbeach, and it can only be done in purity, and there's restrictions as to when it can be consumed, who can consume it, where you can consume it, and so on and so forth. Another thing to be familiar with is that in essence, the mitzvah of offering the Korban Pesach, at least according to Pshutei Shel Mikra, was actually intended only for when they arrived in Eretz Yisrael. In other words, and as we see in fact, throughout the 40 years that they were in the desert, the only Korban Pesach that they offered, and that they offered in the Mishkan, and celebrated it by eating it on the night of Pesach, was this one that's mentioned in this parsha. This was an anomaly. This was something that was innovative only because Hashem had directly instructed them to do it. But for the rest of the 39 years, there was no Korban Pesach. So let's get into the Sicha. In our parsha, after the Torah describes the Korban Pesach, the one and only Korban Pesach, which was offered while they were in the desert, the Torah tells us that, quote, Vayihi Anoshim, there were men that they were tmeim l'nefesh adam, they were impure, having come in contact with a dead body, and they could not offer the Korban Pesach. So they came to Moshe and they said, what did they say? Quote, Anachnu tmeim l'nefesh adam. We are impure because of having come in contact with a dead body. Lama nigora. Why should we be left out? Why should we lose out? Why should we be diminished, excluded from this mitzvah? And then they continue, levilti hakriv es korban Hashem b'moedai, that we should not be able to offer the korban of Hashem in its right time. Now we need to understand, what was their demand? What exactly were they asking for? In other words, they themselves knew and understood. Not only they knew and understood, but they also expressed it. They said, we are tamei, we are impure, so we can't do it. So they knew that they can't do it. They knew why they can't do it. So what exactly was their demand? Now Rashi gives us some insight. Rashi says the following. First of all, the heading in Rashi is Loma Nigara, exclusively. Not Loma Nigara, V'goimer, etc., as he typically would do when he's referencing the rest of the verse. Rather, he says, Loma Nigara, exclusively on these words. Why should we be diminished? Why should we lose out? And here's what Rashi says. Omar Lohem. Moshe Rabbeinu said to them, Ein Kachim Krevim Etuva. You cannot offer the holies, meaning Korbanos, in a state of Tumah, of impurity. So Amrullah, Rashi continues, they said to him, Yizarek Hadom Oleinu, let the blood be sprinkled on our behalf, for us, Bikoyanim Tohirim, with Koyanim, the priests who are Tohir, V'yachil HaBasal Etmeim, and let the meat be eaten to those who are impure. Now there's many things in this Rashi that really need to be understood, need to be clarified. First of all, what does this mean? Rashi says that the flesh, that the meat of the korban should be, quote, eaten to tmeim, to those who are impure. What does he mean? What exactly can it mean? And in fact, indeed, there is a version in Rashi that corrects this and says, no, and let the meat be eaten to those who are pure. We need to understand this. And also, how could they even ask? How can they expect to be allowed to eat from, to consume the flesh of the korban when they are tamei? Because the whole problem is, if they cannot consume it, as we said in the introduction, that they cannot be counted as one of the members. They cannot be registered on the korban. Because the whole point, that the whole way you can register the korban is if you can potentially eat from it. If they know that they are tamei, and therefore there's no way that they can consume from the korban, how were they coming and demanding? In other words, what was their demand? What exactly were they asking for? Asking that they should be counted, that they should be registered on the korban and let someone else eat it. If they can't eat it, they can't be registered. Another thing, what exactly does Rashi mean with the words, quote, that kachim, meaning the holies, korbanos, cannot be offered in a state of impurity? I mean, this is something which is obvious. Why would Moshe even have to say it to them? And where does Rashi get this whole idea that there was a whole back and forth, there was a whole conversation here as Rashi presents it? Where exactly in Pshuta Shemikra does he see it? I mean, the words only say, Loma Nigara. Why should we be diminished? Why should we be left out? And not to offer Hashem's korban? Where does he see that there was a whole back and forth? And what does this mean also? Another question. What exactly do they mean by let the blood be sprinkled on our behalf, meaning it should be made a korban by kohanim who are tohirim, who are pure, in a pure state? Well, of course, everybody agrees, even if you should have some idea that you're allowed to consume it if you're in a state of impurity. But everybody understands that to do the actual korban, to go into the Mishkan and to sprinkle the blood on the Mizbeach, everybody knows it's an obvious, simple thing that you have to be tahor. So why exactly would they stress this? Why exactly would they emphasize this? What exactly is behind what they're saying? And moreover, that Rashi's source for this whole dialogue, back and forth, this whole conversation, actually doesn't quote these words, koyanim tahirim. It's almost like an additive from Rashi himself. Why does Rashi feel compelled to add this? And in other words, how does this contribute to the understanding of what went on over here? The answer for all of this, the explanation is as follows. When you read the words in the pasuk, quote, Lomo nigora levilti hakriv es korban Hashem emayde, that they came and they said, Lomo nigora, why should we be diminished? Why should we lose out? Not to be able to be makriv, to offer the korban of Hashem at its time. Immediately, a very important and fundamental question pops up. We find in reference to Korban Pesach, even in this parsha, in the beginning, and look in verse 1 and 2, how do we typically refer to the offering of the Korban Pesach? It's always in an expression of asiyah. It should be made. V'yasu b'nei Yisrael es Pesach. And the b'nei Yisrael should do the Korban Pesach. In fact, when they weren't able to, what does it say? Vayu anashim, there were men that were tamei, v'lo yochlu lasois es Pesach. They were not able to make, they were not able to do the Korban Pesach. And yet, what was their argument? What are their words? Levilti hakriv is Korban Hashem. That we cannot be makriv, we cannot offer the Korban of Hashem. Why didn't they just say and stick to the same consistent expression that's used in reference to Korban Pesach, which is, they should have said, Levilti asois Korban Hashem. Something happened there. Something new popped up. There was like an epiphany. Something became clear. Something that up until this point was not known to them. And this is what triggers Rashi. This is what gave Rashi the idea in Pshuta Shamikra that there was something more than just the words that appear in the Pasuk. There is a whole dialogue, there's a whole conversation behind the scenes that's playing out. In other words, now they got some clarity, or they understood something new, something they didn't know up until now. And that is that in reference to Korban Pesach, there's not only an asiyah, the making of the Korban Pesach, the doing of the Korban Pesach, but there's also an aspect of hakrava, to be makriv, to offer, that it has the status of a korban. And this is how the conversation went down. And Rashi, therefore, only quotes the words in the heading of Lo Manigara. And he explains, Moshe Rabbeinu said to them, well, kachim, meaning offerings, korbanos, cannot be offered in a state of impurity. Aha! From this they understood something new. That this is not only the mitzvah of Korban Pesach, but now was made clear to them, something they didn't know up to this point, that indeed it also has the status of a korban. And if, therefore, they went back and asked, wait, if that's the case, Amru Loi, they said to Moshe, well, in that case, Yizorek Hadam Aleinu, let the blood be sprinkled on our behalf. And Rashi adds the words, B'koyanim Tahirim, with koyanim that are tahir. In other words, what they were saying is, until now we were not aware that this has this status, and therefore all the stringencies of a korban. Now that you're telling us that it's a korban, it's kachim, and therefore since we're tamei we can't be part of it, we can't do it. Okay, so let someone who's not tamei do it on our behalf, like every korban is done by the koyanim on the behalf of the people. You see, up to that point, before Moshe clarified it to them, they thought perhaps they could do it. And that's why they said Lama Negara. Last year in Mitzrayim, there were no such restrictions. If you're tahir, if you're tamei, everyone was able to do it. To make the Korban Pesach, quote unquote. V'yasu b'nei Yisrael Pesach. Now that Moshe said to them, no, it has the status of a korban. So that's where they retorted, and they said, wait. So let the koyanim tahirim, let the koyanim who are not tamei, let them sprinkle on our behalf. And here's the explanation in all of this. You see, according to Pshat, the Pesach of Mitzrayim, that means the very first Korban Pesach they offered, right before they left Egypt, had not the status of a korban, but it had the status of a zevach. As it says clearly, if you look at Parshas Boi, look in chapter 12, verse 27, it says that when your children ask, what is it that we're doing? Va'amartem, and you shall say, Zevach Pesachul Hashem. Not Korban Pesachul Hashem, but Zevach. This is like a sacrifice. This is not an offering. This is not a korban. So even the fact, if some will try to argue, well, there was some blood involved, which seems to mimic that which is done later in the Mishkan, in the Beis HaMikdash, they had to take the blood and kind of smear it on the doorposts. That was not for the status of korban. That was actually for a different purpose, as clearly spelled out in the pasuk, that Hashem says you put it there and Hashem will recognize the entrances of the Jewish homes. And in fact, all the 40 years that they were in the desert, there was no Korban Pesach. This was the only Korban Pesach. This is the only one that they offered in the entire 40 years. Now, what was in the commandment? What did Hashem say? What were the words? V'yasu b'nei Yisrael es ha'Pesach b'moedoi. that the children of Israel shall do the Korban Pesach, so like all its laws and all its statutes, ye shall do it. Which laws and which statutes? So they thought, well, the same as last year. The same laws and statutes as when we made the Korban Pesach last year, we're going to make it now. And that's when they came to Moshe and they said, Lama Nigara. Just like in Egypt we were able to do it, there was no difference between pure and impure, we should also be able to do it. And this is where Moshe said to them, no. Now it has a whole different gather. It has a whole different status. It has a status also of a korban. And therefore, it can only be offered by those who are pure. And with this we can understand the continuation of the conversation, of the dialogue between them. In other words, namely, the second question. What was their next question? In accordance to what they now understood, that this also has the status of a korban, they understood that in the one hand, it has the same status as the Korban Pesach of Mitzrayim, but that, namely, that you need to have the idea, the aspect of eating, of consumption, in order to be able to be added in, okay, and to be added to the korban. But also they understood that there's an add-on now, that there's something extra, so to speak, which Moshe had just revealed to them, that it also, notice the word, also has the status of a korban. And therefore they understood that from the aspect of korban of it, okay, they can't eat from it. Granted, okay, we understand. Now that it becomes kachim, now that it's holies, we're not going to be able to consume from it because we're not holy. We're not in a pure state. But therefore they asked, let the korban be offered on their behalf and let someone else eat from the korban. Let someone else eat from this korban in a pure state. And that is the words, v'yochel ha-korban l'tohedim. Now we understand exactly how it plays out in Rashi, how it plays out the narrative in detail, play by play. And also we can understand why Rashi adds the words, b'koyanim tohedim, with pure koyanim, with koyanim that are in a pure state, a state of purity. Why? Because again, since it has the status of kachim, they understood that it has to be done in the most pristine manner. But their argument was, let it be eaten by someone else. Now, who should it be eaten by? Depending on the version in Rashi. This Rashi, the way we have it, says, v'ya'ochel b'treim. They thought that maybe, as far as the offering is concerned, granted, it should be done by koyanim tohedim. But as far as the consumption, just like in Mitzrayim, you had, in order to be part of the korban, in order to be registered on the korban, you had to eat from it, or potentially be able to eat from it. Let us eat from it too. In other words, the eating part, the consumption part of the korban, that we should maybe be able to do, not from the aspect of korban of it, but from the aspect of zevach that this Korban Pesach has. Right? Because that is the mitzvah of Pesach. And this is where Moshe answered them, no, that cannot happen. Because this Korban Pesach is part and parcel of the Korban Pesach, not of Mitzrayim, but of what's going to be later. That it has the status of kachim. And therefore, not only does it have to be offered in a state of purity, but also has to be consumed in a state of purity. And therefore, if you cannot yourself eat from it potentially, because you're not in a state of purity, you're tamei, then you cannot be registered on it. And this can also help us understand the version in Rashi, which I mentioned before, which on its face seems to be very odd. What does it mean? What was their question? You should be eaten to, it should be able to be consumed, that people are not pure. You were just told that it's kachim. How would you even ask that question? Well, as we explained, the answer is that true, from the, I'm just repeating it, from the kachim aspect of it, from the offering aspect of it, you're right. We should not be able to have access to it. But from the Korban Pesach, the Zevach Pesach, the Asiyas Pesach aspect of it, that we should be able to. And Moshe said to them, no, it's part and parcel. You cannot separate the two. It all comes together. And then the version that changes the Rashi and says, V'yochel l'tohedim, they asked, let it be eaten by those who are pure. Well, we can understand. It makes sense. Because what they were saying is, okay, let somebody else eat it on our behalf. It's going to be offered on our behalf, so we'll be part of the korban, and let someone eat it on our behalf. So the Korban Pesach was done. We were registered. We didn't eat it. Someone else ate it, right? And at least we got to be part of the korban. And that's when Moshe said, no, you have to be the ones eating from it, but you can't, so you cannot be registered in it. What is the lesson for us in Avodas Hashem? That what they demanded, what they wanted, was at the least to be part of the korban as it's being offered to Hashem. It's going to be, so to speak, elevated to Hashem, even without them having the ability to consume from it, meaning to become part of it, to internalize it. And they were ready. They were ready to, so to speak, suffice with that. It's okay. We won't get that part of the korban, but at least we can give to Hashem. And what we see what Hashem did with this innovation of Pesach Sheni was Hashem said no. To me, saying Hashem says, the ultimate is not that you should elevate it to me, but the ultimate is that you should bring it down to you, that you should be able to consume it, that you should be able to make it part of you, thus transforming you, thus having effect on the person and the world below.